The year was 1867, and the Texas plains lay wide and unforgiving, a country where silence spoke louder than prayer. For Eliza Harper, that silence had been her companion for 5 long years. She had lived alone on a weather-worn homestead, its boards grayed by dust storms and sun, its roof patched more times than she cared to count. A narrow corral leaned in on itself like a tired old man, and her small garden fought daily wars against rabbits and drought. The world around her was vast and empty, but it pressed in just the same. She rose before dawn as always, pulling on a faded calico dress, her hair tucked back in a no-nonsense braid. The pump creaked under her hand as she hauled up water from the well, each pull echoing against the wide horizon. The sound reminded her of her husband, Daniel, who had worked this land beside her until the raid. He had been tall and steady, his laugh quick, his shoulders broad enough to carry any load. Until one evening when a band of men, half-drunk and hungry for cattle, stormed across the plains. They took the herd, shot him down when he stood in their way, and left her with nothing but an empty bed and a silence she'd never outrun. In the years since, Eliza had taught herself to live without depending on another soul. She could shoot as well as any man mend fences and smoke her own meat. But nights were the worst. When the wind slipped through the cracks in the shutters and coyotes yelped on the ridge, she sometimes pressed her palm to her belly, remembering the child she never got a hold, lost the same night Daniel bled out on the floor. Loneliness was a heavy cloak, and though she wore it well, it had frayed the edges of her spirit. That evening, the air carried a strange weight. The sky stretched pale and coppery, and the wind had died to a hush that made the land seem breathless. Eliza was chopping kindling behind the cabin when she felt it, the ground trembling beneath her boots. She straightened, her breath catching. Far out on the horizon, a blur of motion broke the stillness. A dust plume rose, curling gold in the dying light. Hoofbeats, steady many strong. She dropped the hatchet, heart pounding. 5 riders emerged from a haze, their silhouettes sharpening with each thundering stride. They were not settlers. Even before she saw the paint on their faces and the black braids whipping behind them, she knew. Comanche. Eliza's first thought was to run inside, bar the door, grab the rifle. But she knew a thin pine door wouldn't hold if they meant to break it. Her only chance was to stand her ground. She snatched the rifle from the porch, braced it tight against her shoulder, and waited. The riders slowed as they neared, drawing up in a semicircle a dozen yards from her gate. They were giants of men, broad-shouldered, sinew-taut as bowstrings, their horses snorting clouds into the cooling air. Their eyes gleamed with something between curiosity and hunger. They spoke low among themselves, words she couldn't follow, though the cadence was sharp. One of them urged his horse a step forward. His presence filled the air like thunder. His face was cut with scars that caught the light, his hair bound with leather strips, a bone knife hanging at his chest. When he spoke, his English was thick, but clear enough. "Woman," he said, voice rough as gravel. "We ride long. We need shelter." Eliza's finger tightened on the trigger. Shelter? From her? She wanted to spit at the notion. Yet her throat locked, caught between fear and a strange calm. She had lived through enough winters to know that when a storm gathered on the plains, it cared little who you were. Behind the men, clouds had piled black against the setting sun, flashes of lightning veining through them. Her eyes darted from one rider to the next. The second was leaner, hawk-nosed, his gaze sharp as an arrow point. The third had shoulders like an ox and carried a bow longer than she was tall. The fourth wore beads across his chest and a necklace of claws that rattled when he shifted. But it was the fifth, sitting quieter than the rest, eyes dark and watchful, that made her pause. He was younger, his expression less carved from stone. Unlike the others, he didn't leer at her or at the rifle in her hands. His gaze lingered not with challenge, but with something unreadable. "You ride on," she said, steadying her voice though her knees quivered beneath her dress. "This land ain't for strangers." The scarred leader's lips twitched. Lightning cracked behind him, illuminating his frame like a devil etched from fire. "Storm comes. Horses tired. We not ask twice. It was no request. Eliza knew if she turned them away, they might take what they needed by force. Her finger hovered on the trigger. But what good was one rifle against 5 hardened warriors? She breathed through her teeth, lowering the barrel inch by inch. "You come in," she said, voice sharp, "but you touch nothing that ain't offered. Or I'll put lead in the first one who tries." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the scarred man barked a word in his tongue, and the others swung from their saddles. Eliza stepped back toward the door, rifle still raised. They ducked inside, one after the other, their sheer presence filling the small cabin until it seemed the walls might burst. The hearth glowed faintly, embers smoldering low. Eliza stoked it, casting a warm flicker that painted the warriors' faces in shifting reds. They crouched near the fire, shaking rain from their braids as the storm finally broke against the roof, thunder booming, rain lashing down in sheets. She set a pot on the flames, dropping in the last of her beans. Her stores were thin, but there was no choice. They watched her every move, their eyes bright with hunger. She placed bowls on the table, hand never straying far from the rifle propped against the wall. When the food was ladled out, they ate with a ferocity that made her stomach knot. Yet the young one, the quiet-eyed warrior, ate slower, more deliberate. When he caught her watching, he inclined his head in something that might have been respect. The scarred leader wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, fixing her with a stare. "You alone here?" Eliza set her jaw. "What's it to you?" His lips curved, not kindly. Strange. A woman alone. Strong, maybe. Foolish, more. Before she could retort, the quiet one spoke low in his tongue. Whatever he said made the leader grunt, tossing a bone into the fire. The others chuckled, but not cruelly, more as if the storm and the woman had given them unexpected entertainment.
Later, as the night deepened, Eliza went to fetch more wood. Her hand trembled on the latch, knowing any one of them could rise behind her and she'd be powerless. But when she opened the door, the young warrior was already there, arms full of kindling he'd gathered without her asking. He set it down beside her and stepped back into the shadows, offering no words. She stared after him, unsettled. When she returned inside, the fire roared higher, crackling warmth into the cabin. The warriors stretched on the floor, some already dozing, their weapons stacked within reach. The scarred leader sat cross-legged, eyes closed, as if listening to the thunder. Eliza sank into her chair, rifle laid across her lap. Sleep would not come easy, but she could not shake the memory of the young man's eyes, dark pools that had met hers without mockery, without threat. She had lived years with no one to look at her that way. The storm raged through the night, hammering the roof, rattling the shutters. She sat awake, the rifle's cold iron steady across her knees, heart drumming in time with the thunder. 5 Comanche warriors under her roof. The land had a way of testing what a body was made of, and Eliza Harper, widow, alone too long, now stood at the edge of a trial she hadn't asked for. And as lightning burned the sky and rain washed the plains clean, she knew her life would not remain untouched. For in that flickering firelight, one pair of eyes had lingered longer than the rest. The storm had clawed at the cabin all night, rattling shutters and moaning through the cracks, yet by dawn the sky lay wrung clean. The land shimmered wet and dark beneath the pale gold of morning. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, smoke, and men who did not belong there. Eliza Harper had not closed her eyes once. She sat rigid in her chair, rifle heavy across her lap, watching the Comanche breathe. They stirred as the sun pushed through the clouds. The scarred leader rose first, his movements deliberate, as if he owned the place. He stretched, bones popping, then barked a word to the others. The biggest of them laughed and began strapping his bow. They seemed unconcerned with her watchfulness, as if a lone woman's defiance was nothing worth remarking. Only the quiet one, Koha, she thought she heard the others call him, cast her a glance that was neither hostile nor careless. His eyes held the weight of someone who saw more than he let slip. She moved to the hearth, pouring water into the pot, pretending calm. The storm had left her stores pitifully low. If these men stayed much longer, she'd have nothing left to last the week. Yet she said nothing, for one word too sharp could set fire to dry grass. She ladled what little was left of the beans, and when they took the bowls, she watched their hands, scarred knuckles, rings of sinew, fingers calloused from bowstrings and reins. Not men who knew idleness. The scarred one, their leader, finally spoke. "We leave when sky clears." His tone made it plain. They would leave when it pleased them, not her. She met his gaze, holding it longer than a woman alone should have dared. "The sooner the better," she replied. A chuckle rolled from the big warrior with the necklace of claws. His laugh had no kindness in it. "Fire woman," he muttered in his tongue, and the others grinned. But Koha cut them a look, sharp and cool, and their laughter stilled. That small defense did not go unnoticed. The day wore on with a strange tension. The rain had softened the earth outside, and the creek ran swollen and loud. Her supplies dwindled, yet the Comanches showed no urgency to leave. Instead they repaired tack, checked arrows, and shared low talk she could not decipher. Eliza tried to busy herself with chores, hanging damp clothes, sweeping grit from the floor, but the weight of their presence pressed on her chest. Near midday, when the clouds broke wide, she strapped on her boots and lifted the rifle. "I'm going hunting," she said. The scarred leader looked up. "Alone?" His lip curled. "Coyote eat you before you find rabbit." Her hand tightened on the rifle. "I've lived here 5 years. Fed myself every day of it." Koha rose then, speaking softly to the leader in their language. After a moment, the scarred man shrugged, waving a hand. Koha turned to her. "We go with you." His voice was quieter than the others, but there was no mistaking it for a suggestion. So she went out with them, 6 shadows moving into the dripping woods. The air smelled sharp, rain still dripping from the branches. They tracked sign through the mud, deer prints, scat, bent grass. Eliza kept her rifle ready, refusing to let them think she was tagging along like some helpless settler's wife. The chance came sudden. A young buck lifted its head from the brush, ears flicking. Eliza raised her rifle quick, breath held. The crack of the shot split the damp air. The deer staggered, collapsed in the fern. She lowered the rifle, smoke curling from the barrel, her pulse pounding. The Comanche stared. For a long heartbeat there was silence, then the big one with the necklace of claws barked laughter, slapping his thigh. "Woman shoots before men," he crowed. The scarred leader narrowed his eyes, unreadable. Koha, though, stepped forward to the kill. He drew his knife, finished the deer clean, and when his eyes met hers, there was the smallest tilt of respect. They set to dressing the carcass, working fast with practiced hands. Eliza knelt beside them, her own knife steady. She could feel Koha's presence beside her, the quiet focus he carried. The work was gritty, blood soaking into the mud, but it was survival. When the wolves came, it turned from work to battle in a heartbeat. A low growl slid from the brush. Then another. Yellow eyes blinked between the trees. Wolves, drawn by blood and meat. The warriors rose, bows lifted, knives flashing. Eliza cocked her rifle. The first wolf lunged, teeth bared. Arrows hissed, struck fur. She fired, the kick of the rifle slamming her shoulder. The beast dropped, yelping, but more came, slinking low, jaws snapping. Chaos filled the clearing. Growls, shouts, the twang of bowstrings. One wolf leapt at Eliza, jaws aimed for her throat. She turned too slow, then Koha barreled in, knife flashing. He drove steel into the beast's side, but not before its teeth tore his arm. Blood spurted, hot against her cheek. She cried out, blasting another wolf that sprang for them. At last, silence fell. The wolves slunk off, 3 dead in the grass, the rest melting back into the shadows. The men breathed hard, sweat shining on their faces. Koha sank to one knee, clutching his arm where the wolf had bitten deep. Blood soaked the leather at his shoulder. Eliza dropped beside him, hands moving without thought. Hold still. She ripped a strip from her skirt, pressing it tight. He winced but did not pull away. The other warriors watched, some smirking, others grim. The scarred leader's gaze burned like coals, but he said nothing. She bound the wound tight, her fingers brushing the hard muscle of his arm. When she looked up, his eyes were on her, not just with pain, but something quieter, something she had not felt in years. A recognition of hurt that mirrored her own. Back at the cabin, she cleaned the wound with whiskey, his jaw tight as stone. He did not flinch, though the fire in his eyes flickered. When she tied the final knot, he gave a single nod. Strong, he murmured. That night, they sat close to the fire, the storm gone but its memory alive in the dripping eaves. The warriors spoke low among themselves, laughter rough, but Eliza found herself listening only for Koha's voice. When the talk lulled, he leaned slightly toward her. Your husband. She stiffened. Gone. His gaze did not leave hers. Mine too. His words were halting, but clear. Wife, child. Both gone. The fire cracked between them. She swallowed hard, her throat thick. To hear her grief echoed in another's tongue pierced deeper than any storm. For a long moment they said nothing, but silence now held kinship, not threat. Later, when most had slept, Tahu, the scarred leader, watched her with an expression she could not read. His eyes slid to Koha, then back. At last he spoke low, only for Koha to hear, though Eliza caught the words. A Comanche heart belongs to the tribe, not a settler woman. Koha's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Eliza lay awake, staring at the rafters, the weight of that warning heavy as stone. She told herself it meant nothing. These men would ride on soon, and she would be left with her solitude. Yet her hand strayed to the memory of his blood on her skin, his eyes in the firelight, and she knew the lie of her own heart. The next night, danger came on 2 legs, not 4. She woke to the crunch of hooves outside, the creak of saddles. Men's voices, low and mean. She rose, rifle in hand, heart hammering. Through the shutter she saw them, riders, 6 white men with rifles, circling her homestead. The scarred leader was already up, whispering sharp commands. The Comanche reached for their weapons. Eliza's stomach turned to stone. She recognized one of the riders, a man from town, the kind who spat at her when she came for salt, the kind who would burn a woman's place to the ground just to see it light. A voice rang out. We know you're in there. Heard tell you're harborin' Comanche. Laughter followed, ugly and eager. Come on out, or we'll smoke you out like rats. The Comanche shifted, eyes blazing. Eliza felt every beat of her pulse, her finger tight on the rifle. This was no longer about beans or storms. This was about survival, about where she stood and with whom. Koha's gaze found hers in the dim cabin, steady as bedrock. He gave the smallest nod, as if to say, You are not alone in this. And outside, rifles cocked. The night held its breath. The first shot had not yet fired, but war crouched at the doorstep. The air outside was heavy with the stench of wet earth and gun oil. Hooves stamped restlessly in the dark, riders circling like buzzards scenting blood. Inside the cabin, the Comanche crouched low, hands tight on bowstrings and knives, their silhouettes tense in the firelight. Eliza Harper stood in the center, rifle pressed against her shoulder, the wood biting into her cheek. Her heart thundered in her chest, but her gaze was steady. 5 years alone had taught her that fear did nothing but waste breath. The voice outside barked again, closer now. Last chance, Harper. Hand over them devils you're keepin', or we'll put fire to your roof and send you screamin' to hell. Laughter rose among the men, sharp and cruel. They thought her weak, thought her a widow trembling behind the walls of her cabin. They had no notion of what she had become. The scarred leader, Tahu, leaned close, his breath warm on her ear. We fight, we spill blood. They come back with more. His eyes burned with a wild light, but there was calculation there too. He had seen wars enough to know what numbers could do. They'll kill me whether you're here or not, Eliza whispered back, her voice low and hard. Better I fall fighting than beg mercy from their kind. Koha's gaze caught hers in the firelight. He said nothing, but the nod he gave her, small, steady, sent a current through her bones. He was ready to stand beside her. That knowledge steadied her more than the rifle in her hands. The first shot cracked, splintering the doorframe, filling the cabin with the acrid stink of gunpowder. One of the Comanche loosed an arrow in reply, the hiss cutting through the night, followed by a strangled shout. Then all was chaos. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the plains, muzzle flashes tearing at the dark. Eliza pressed herself to the window, squeezing the trigger. Her shot dropped a rider from the saddle, his scream drowned in thunder. Another bullet whined past her head, splintering the wall. She ducked, reloaded with shaking hands, and rose again. The cabin rattled with the violence. Tahu shouted commands in his tongue, his warriors moving like shadows, swift and ruthless. Arrows flew, striking true. One of the men outside screamed for his brother, his cry cut short by the thud of a shaft through his chest. The settlers hadn't expected a fight like this, not from a widow, not from Comanche under her roof. Eliza's pulse hammered as she fired again, the kick bruising her shoulder. Another rider tumbled into the mud. But in the clash, one of the Comanche, young, fierce, his necklace of claws clattering as he moved, caught a bullet square in the chest. He fell without a sound, eyes wide, the firelight catching them one last time before they dimmed. The others roared, fury igniting their strikes. Tahu leapt through the door, knife gleaming, dragging a settler from the saddle and opening his throat in one brutal sweep. Blood sprayed, dark against the rain-washed ground. Koha fired an arrow over Tahu's shoulder, felling another who aimed at the leader's back. Eliza could taste iron in her mouth, though she hadn't been touched. Her hands moved on instinct now, load, aim, fire, each crack of her rifle blending with the beat of her heart. She was no longer the lonely woman hiding behind shutters. She was part of this fight, part of the storm. At last the settlers broke. Those still living wheeled their horses, shouting curses, spurring hard into the night. Their hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the darkness. Silence fell, thick and sudden, broken only by the hiss of rain and the rasp of heavy breathing. Eliza lowered her rifle, chest heaving. The cabin door hung shattered on its hinges. Smoke curled in the air, mingling with the copper tang of blood. She looked to the fallen Comanche, his body sprawled on her floor, life already gone. The others knelt beside him, voices low in their tongue, grief heavy in the room. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. Without thinking, she crossed the room to a small chest by her bed. From it she drew a folded shirt, worn but precious, the last belonging of Daniel she had kept untouched all these years. She laid it gently across the fallen warrior's chest. The men stilled, eyes lifting to her. Tahu's gaze, fierce and unyielding, softened for the first time. Koha's eyes shone with something deeper, something that reached into her hollow places and lit them. They carried their brother outside, setting his body upon a pyre of wood. The fire blazed high, sparks rushing into the night sky. The warriors chanted low, voices rumbling like distant thunder. Eliza stood among them, her hands clasped tight, the heat of the flames washing her face. She felt Daniel beside her in that moment, felt the child she never held, felt the weight of all the losses borne by those who lived on this unforgiving land. When the fire sank low, Tahu turned to the others. "We ride at dawn," he said. His voice left no room for argument. But Koha lingered. He stood apart, his wounded arm bound tight in the cloth she had tied, his eyes locked on her. They did not speak as the others settled for the night, yet the silence between them spoke more than words could carry. When the first pale streaks of morning touched the sky, the warriors saddled their horses. Tahu mounted, his frame a shadow against the rising sun. He looked down at Eliza, his gaze unreadable, then spurred his horse forward. The others followed, hooves drumming soft against the damp earth. Koha was last. He stood with his horse, reins in hand, his eyes on her face. She wanted to speak, to tell him to stay, to confess the strange, fierce bond that had kindled between them in fire and blood, but the words caught in her chest. He stepped closer, lifting his good hand. His fingers brushed hers, calloused and warm, a touch that lingered like a promise. "I come back," he said simply. His English was rough, but the meaning struck clear as a bullet. Her breath caught. "Spring?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her strength. He nodded once. Then he mounted, wheeled his horse, and rode after the others, his figure shrinking against the endless horizon. Eliza stood alone before the cabin, the earth scarred with blood and hoofprints, smoke still curling from the pyre. But she no longer felt the silence pressing in as it had before. Something had shifted, something that could not be undone. She was still a widow, still a woman alone on the plains, yet inside her chest burned a fire she thought long dead. The land stretched vast around her, wild and merciless. She knew the settlers would return, that storms and hunger would still stalk her. But she also knew she would face it differently now. She was no longer just a survivor, no longer just a shadow haunting an empty home. She had fought, she had bled, she had stood beside men who the world called enemies, and one of them had looked at her as though she were not invisible, not forgotten, but alive. That night, as she stoked the fire in her cabin, the wind whispered through the chinks in the walls. Once, that sound had been a cruel reminder of loneliness. Now it was a reminder of promise, of hoofbeats fading into dawn, of a man's steady eyes in the storm. The narrator's voice would have said it plain if anyone had been there to hear. The frontier was a place that stripped a soul to its bone, tested it, broke it, or made it burn brighter than before. And in that broken land, sometimes two fires found each other in the dark. Eliza Harper sat by the flames, rifle across her lap, her heart no longer hollow but heavy with something new. She had lived alone for years. She might yet live alone longer. But she was waiting now, waiting with a strength she hadn't known was still hers. For in the silence of the plains, she could still hear the echo of a promise. "I come back."